Greetings, Guardians, my name is Bife here. So, Revenant is around the corner. Here's a handy summary of all the lore you need to know before jumping in. First things first, what characters are we going to see and what are the themes? Well, we should be slated to see a heavy Eliksni cast this time around, as to be expected. Expect to see the 4 big Eliksni from the Lost City or our allied territories, namely Mithrax, the Kell of the House of Light, Eido, the House of Light's scribe, the Spider, and Variks the Loyal of House Judgment. Granted, I don't know if Variks is actually in the Lost City still, but heck, here we are. You can also expect an appearance or two from Crow this time around, I'd wager, especially given that he's connected to the Eliksni, the Reef, and the major villain this time around, Fikrul, the Fanatic. Before we get into that though, I would also expect to see some more from Eramis, the former Kell of the House of Salvation, who has since kind of abandoned her house and her cause. The plot of the episode is supposedly going to tie up the loose threads of the current Eliksni plot lines, which include topics such as the fate of Mithrax and Eramis, the future of the Eliksni as a people generally, the story of the mythology of the Kell of Kells, and while we're at it, I would expect also some evolution or concluding of the story of Crow and Fikrul. So, let's go ahead and break down each of these topics. Eramis and Mithrax are 2 of the most senior Eliksni figures in the setting. They have a ton of authority based on them being the last 2 Kells that are really still in the game that are worth mentioning at the moment. They're also the Kells of Light and Darkness, thus the 2 of them represent a pair of potential pathways for their species which are incompatible with one another. One of these paths sees them going to more closely ally with humanity and embrace the Traveler in the ways of old once again. The newer, more contemporary way is the Way of Darkness, in stark contrast to this, where the Eliksni should embrace a more contemporary set of hatreds for humanity and reject the Traveler entirely, along with all those who fight for it. In this battle of wills and ways, I think it's pretty clear, based on both Eramis's actions and the defeat of the Witness, that the House of Light has philosophically prevailed. They are ascendant. Eramis might still be around, but she's been beaten in the most important of senses. She knows this too. She has openly admitted that a part of the reason she reached out to Eido back in the Season of the Plunder was because Eido represented a future for the Eliksni and Eramis herself represented the past. By the time that she was beaten in the Season of the Plunder, by the time she was unable to destroy the Traveler with Rasputin's weapons, she acknowledged that she was beaten, and she even betrayed the Witness at the very end. There is the acknowledgement that Eido is the next great leader of the Eliksni people generally, and that both Eramis and Mithrax are too old and too tired to continue on their fights. They've both clung to the remnants of an old world or an old way of life that no longer truly serves their people or even exists, in the case of Eramis, who is clinging on to the memory of what Rhys was. For Eramis, I think this means that there will potentially be either a last desperate gambit as she binds her forces to that of Fikrul and sort of flails for purpose, or alternatively, and in a much more likely circumstance, I think she will slowly come around to the idea of helping the Eliksni House of Light in a tense alliance that slowly brings her back into the fold somehow. Inevitably, with the 2 of them being allegorical for the past, there is a distinct possibility that both Eramis and Mithrax might actually die to represent the old past of the Eliksni people having been let go, and allowing the Eliksni people to embrace the future and move on. This would also then make Eido the presumptive Kell of all that remains. There is much more pressing stuff in Mithrax's story as well, and a more pressing note that he may pass away, as we've learned recently in the lore that he holds onto the Curse of Nezarec still, and is likely to be in a position where he needs to either expel and cleanse the curse, or he will die because of it. This might also make for a noble kind of death, where he gets to atone for the past sins of his old life when he was a pirate captain, empowered by one of Nezarec's relics and with no scruples whatsoever. This means he might ultimately find redemption and thus peace. Don't be surprised if Mithrax and his potential death is a major plot point this season, and don't be surprised if it's a noble death, one that has at least a little meaning, even if it's only so that Ido or someone else can escape. This also leads us to the myth of the Kell of Kells, which I believe the narrative team at one point stated was going to be a key point that they were going to touch on. The myth of the Kell of Kells implies that there would be a kind of messianic figure of sorts to reunite the Eliksni people. It is spoken of in the prophecies of the House of Rain, and it's been something referenced in the lore for over a decade now. They talk of how all Ketches would bend to the authority of the Kell of Kells, and how the Great Machine would even acknowledge the Kell of Kells. The Great Machine, of course, being the Traveler, the object of their pursuit for so long. This has been a really powerful myth for the Eliksni people. Culturally, it's bound them together, like the story of the one who had 10,000 arms, and the diaspora that the whirlwind forced them to embark upon. It is one of their defining myths as a people. It spurred them on in moments such as the Battle of the Six Fronts and the Battle of Twilight Gap, even when they lost, and when they knew there was a chance for redemption, they fought even harder all the same. It has been one of the leading myths that has culturally bound them together after the collapse of their entire civilization, and ultimately it represents the Eliksni people's final goal of being viewed as worthy by the Traveler and finding themselves in its good graces again so that their civilization might once more rise. House Rain's prophecy was more poetic than it was specific, but the idea of the Great Machine acknowledging individuals is already something we've sort of seen with Mithrax. He hears the voice of the Traveler and is a speaker to a certain extent, meaning that he does have a fundamental connection with the light. When you interact with some of the feathers within the Pale Heart, sometimes you can hear Mithrax speaking and describing visions that he's being shown by the Traveler itself. All this combined with the possibility of him and other characters in the setting dying during the course of this episode makes me wonder if we might actually see this happen, where the Traveler reaches out and acknowledges one of the fallen Eliksni as the Kell of Kells, raising them as a guardian. The Traveler is very changed at this point, given that it's a combination of both light and darkness now, but I still think we have to contemplate the possibility that there's a ghost out there, somewhere, who chooses to resurrect an Eliksni guardian. And we have to then ask the question of what if that guardian is Mithrax, Eramis, or even Ido? An Eliksni guardian is also not impossible, and we know that because the Lucent Hive exist. Guardians do not have to be human, exo, or awoken alone. They just need to be among what the Traveler deems as the worthy dead. So that becomes then an important question for the Kell of Kells story and how it's going to get resolved. It means that there's potentially a way for a new Eliksni leader to rise, who has been resurrected by the Traveler. And when all is said and done, whoever that may be, well, they're going to define the future of this civilization. With that in mind, I think that there's a very strong possibility that Ido might die and then become the Kell of Kells herself. There is a lot of lore rolling around lately about her trying to volunteer for a bunch of missions in the field, or to just go on them covertly without anyone's permission. She's also been trying to reach out to Eramis, which the Spider picked up on, as well as the Hidden. So I think there's a decent chance that she'll find herself in harm's way, only for us to then go back, rescue her, and inevitably bring her back to the city so that she will be able to go on. But narratively, who knows, that might change. All this brings us to our villain, the wonderful Fikrul the Fanatic, who hopefully is once again going to be voiced by the great Matt Mercer. We shall see. Anyway, with that being said, how about we talk about him for a second? For those of you who have forgotten, this is going to be a little refresher, because Fikrul is one of those obscure kind of B-list characters within Destiny's cast, but he has been around in the background moving and shaking quite a bit. Fikrul was the first of the Scorn, and he's been trying to raise them as their own people since his resurrection by then Prince Aldrin Sov, who of course is now the Guardian Hunter Vanguard, Crow. Fikrul was less than pleased with the turn of events that we saw happen in Forsaken, where we murdered the Barons of the Tangled Shore. It's also important to note that the Scorn that we faced in the Warlord's Ruin dungeon quite recently were a mix of those who had died as the House of Kings and various knights who were envoys sent by Fikrul under the premise of building a bridge so that he might be able to reunite the peoples of the Scorn. Of course, they all fell prey to Hefend the Ahamkara, which is an unfortunate trait of the Scorn generally. One with a strong enough will can wrest command of them from Fikrul. Which is a shame all in itself, because whilst he may be a villain, Fikrul at very least is principled. He has been trying to impart culture and identity on the Scorn, and he has definitely been trying to make it so that they are actually people with their own choices. They're not necessarily a mindless horde of zombies in the same way that one might expect. There is a culture that forms amongst the Scorn if they've been around long enough, and if they've not deteriorated too much. It's also well worth noting that even though he has lost those various knights that were sent to the Warlord's ruin, Fikrul has still got quite a bit of power personally, even if his armies are slightly at deficit. And that's partly because he's immortal. Yeah, we've killed him a few million times farming for Mindbender's ambition in the Hollowed Lair strike, and every single one of those times was canon. It's one of those weird moments where Destiny does actually give you the possibility of having a reason why you run this activity so many times. Fikrul keeps returning to life, and that's why the Vanguard kept sending those fire teams for so many years. They had no other option than to contain him and to continuously cut him down. It's one hell of a way to develop a bad grudge for us. All this would be bad enough if he hadn't acquired one of the more important artifacts to emerge after the defeat of the Witness, one of the Echoes. With this Echo, which has now been placed atop his staff, there's no telling what he could do, but I fear he might be doing something terrible with the Eliksni generally. This season is framing him as a conqueror who is gathering catches and many minions to his side to form an army. There's also the note of us being vampire hunters of a sort this season, the so-called Slayer Baron. They are responsible for hunting down the greatest nightmares and creatures amongst the Eliksni back on Reese. Or at least they were when that was still part of their culture. And this brings us to that amazing little note about what might happen with Fikrul and how he might use the Echo. Because, well, he's been described as a vampire, and we've been described as vampire hunters. And what do vampires do? Well, they make more vampires. Yeah, there's an interesting parallel that one of my friends brought up to me on this one. And it's simply that we don't really know what happens when Dark Ether is directly infused into a normal Eliksni. Kind of like a vampire taking a bite, and then the exchange of blood goes on. You're starting to see where all this comes along. Is it possible that this is part of the power that Fikrul might be attempting to exploit? And is this the reason why he is gathering not just Scorn, but potentially even Eliksni who are disenfranchised to his banner? Eliksni who might more willingly take on his gift and become immortal for the price of servitude. Any plot involving Fikrul likely also involves Crow, so you can expect their story to finally get wrapped up for sure. There is also one last thing you absolutely should consider, which is this. In some of the promotional art and some of the trailers of episodes, we keep seeing worm gods in a potion bottle, or worm gods being approached by the Eliksni. This makes me wonder if they're either being controlled by Fikrul, or if there's a tentative alliance where they're lending him their power, which seems possible, but either way could be what happens, considering that Fikrul now has an Echo. For further context, the worm gods were the ancient deities of the Hive, the ones that initially made the bargain with them on Fundament and made them immortal at the price of, essentially, an infinite blood tithe, because of binding the worms to them. And there are not that many worm gods left. There were 5 originally, 6 if you also count the mother worm, Sita, and many more if you count the ones that died in the civil war of Arsa's people. But now there are only 3 left. The Everhunger, Aya the Keeper of Order, and Yul the Honest Worm, the original worm who spoke to Ulrix and made the pact. For all we know, we might be killing them as the climax of this season. Something else worth noting this time around is also that whilst we've killed a worm god before, that was Zol, and he was the weakest of the bunch when there were only 4 of them after Oryx killed Akka. But how weak is a worm god compared to other worm gods? Well, he was so weak that... how do we put this? You know Yul, the one I mentioned earlier who made the deal initially with Orash, aka Oryx? Yeah, Yul is meant to be the strongest of them. And it was a point to be made in the lore that Yul at a certain point was so strong that he was looking hungrily in Zol's direction. Yul thought that Zol might soon be fitting prey. So I want you to imagine something big and powerful enough to fight, kill, and eat Zol, the Will of Thousands, another worm god. Then you're on track to understand the scope of that power and what we might be going up against this season. If that is a boss fight, it could be genuinely massive in terms of scale. And it could be a conclusion to more than just what happens here in Revenant. It could even go on to affect what happens in Heresy. If that is meant to be the moment where the Hive Pantheon is upended, then we might be the ones to do it. All that being said, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like, and let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments section. Are you, like me, as I say in the video, of the opinion that it's likely we'll see a few characters die as the Eliksni story arcs come to their conclusion here? Or do you reckon it's going to go in a different direction? Also, remember to subscribe for more stories from worlds near and far. But as per usual, know that your viewership, as always, is quite enough for me, and that in the meantime, my name is Byf. Per Audacia ad Astra. I'll see you, Starside.